Can you believe a tiny smirk could unravel a career? Brett Kavanaugh thought his laugh would brush her aside, but Jasmine Crockett had been waiting for that exact moment. She sprung the trap, turned his own record against him, and the courtroom gasped. In seconds, the balance of power flipped, but the real shock wasn't what she said, it was what came after. That day was supposed to be routine. A voting rights hearing lined with charts, citations, and the usual dance between counsel and the bench. Jasmine Crockett was in stride, laying out how shuttered DMV offices and vanished Sunday voting hours added up to barriers you could measure in lives. The gallery listened, pens scratching, cameras steady, until suddenly, Brett Kavanaugh shifted forward. One small sound from him, half laugh, half dismissal, escaped and carried farther than it should have, landing in that room of ritual like a public insult. Across the room, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett did not flinch, 44 years old, first term, Texas. The emerald of her suit drew a clean line through the dark paneling and the horizon of black robes. If the laugh was meant to shrink her, it failed. Her chin lifted. Her gaze did not leave the bench. Under the lectern light, she squared the page edges with one thumb, an old litigator's habit, then stilled her hands. Something funny about constitutional rights, Justice Kavanaugh. She didn't raise her voice. She sharpened it. The question held in the air like a tight wire strung between the two of them. Keys stopped clacking. A cough died mid-breath. Somewhere, a law clerk paused, as if the script hadn't been emailed to him. A reporter typed, "Nothing to see here," then backspaced the line into oblivion. To feel why the air thinned, see what the room already knew. Kavanaugh, 59, Yale, pedigree, years on the federal bench, had become a conservative mainstay on voting rights. He wore the robe like a fortress, symbol and shield at once, and often met arguments he disliked with the ritual economy of a pen tap and a narrowed question. Crockett, new to Washington but not to combat, had earned her scars in Texas courtrooms and committee rooms, fighting the engineered inconveniences that keep ballots out of reach. She had not come to be polite. She had come to be exact. This case was no clerical dispute. It was a hinge. Swing it wrong, and millions disproportionately, minority, elderly, disabled, working class, could find themselves at a locked door marked ballot. The consequences would travel downward and upward at once. School boards and county judges on one end, the House and a presidency on the other. That was the scale of the room. A chuckle tried to make it small. Crockett moved to her exhibits, and the spark became flame. The data clearly show these ID requirements disproportionately impact low-income communities, she said, voice steady enough to set the tempo. On the screen, 3 university studies lined up like witnesses sworn in. One chart traced DMV closures clustering in the same counties where public bus routes had been cut back last year. Another mapped the elimination of Sunday voting, the day churches once ran vans, souls to the polls, straight from the pews to the precincts. A third narrowed to hours, early voting windows shaved down until only the salaried could slip through. She translated numbers into lives. An 80-year-old in a rural precinct who lost her driver's license and now rides with a neighbor, except the neighbor works shifts and the nearest licensing office is open during those shifts only. A disabled veteran who has the documents but not the time. 3 visits. A clerk's lunch break. A missing form. A single mother who knows the paperwork she needs and the distance she must travel and the day's wages she can't afford to lose. From the bench came the pen taps. A patient audience learns rhythms like these, and then the taps stopped. Kavanaugh leaned to the microphone. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, tone clipped smooth, "every state has some form of voter identification requirement. Are you suggesting that all of these long-standing measures are somehow discriminatory?" He framed it as a question, but everyone heard the rebuke. Crockett didn't rush. She let one breath pass, then a second, as the lights hummed and the gallery held itself very still. Her right hand rested on a blue binder tab labeled Impact, and when she looked up, her eyes were steady. "No, Justice Kavanaugh. I'm suggesting this specific law creates unnecessary barriers that target certain communities. There's a significant difference between reasonable verification, her gaze didn't waver, and deliberate obstruction. The last two words hit bone. Motive, not just metric. In the press row, someone finally remembered to breathe. On the far aisle, a clerk's shoe stopped its nervous scrape. A camera's red light steadied, as if it, too, had decided to pay attention. The tension rose like steam trapped under marble. Every shift of fabric, every cough, felt amplified, unnatural. Justices who usually maintained poker faces betrayed flickers. Clarence Thomas's glance toward Alito, a quick arch of Ketanji Brown Jackson's brow. All eyes fixed on Jasmine Crockett, who was no longer simply presenting an argument, she was building a case for the soul of democracy itself. Her voice carried the edge of lived experience as she laid out the map. DMV offices shuttered in predominantly black counties. Sunday voting erased from the calendar. Early voting hours shaved down until only the privileged could use them. She wasn't describing inconveniences. She was narrating obstacles engineered with precision. On the screen behind her, graphics told the story in colors and lines. The districts most affected were not random. The targeting was obvious, predictable, predictably cruel. "These aren't coincidences," Crockett said, her voice low but resonant, filling every crevice of the chamber. "These are deliberate measures with predictable impacts." The reaction came sharp. Kavanaugh leaned forward, his tone laced with the weary superiority of someone lecturing a student. "The Constitution doesn't guarantee convenience, Congresswoman," he said. "States have legitimate interests in preventing fraud and ensuring election integrity." It was meant to be a kill shot, a line designed to remind the room of hierarchy. But Crockett was ready. "With respect," she replied, steady and unflinching, "there has been no credible evidence of widespread fraud to justify restrictions of this scope. None. We cannot pretend to balance state interests against phantom threats while ignoring the very real burden on millions of eligible citizens." Her words thudded against the marble like iron shoes. And then came the moment that turned an exchange into a clash. As Crockett cited a 1965 precedent, Kavanaugh's lips curled again, this time not just a smirk but a soft chuckle, almost indulgent. He shook his head, as if listening to a child's naive attempt at debate. The sound reverberated. This time, it did not pass unnoticed. Journalists jerked their heads upward. The gallery stirred. Even Justice Jackson, so composed, let one brow rise slightly higher. The chamber froze. Crockett stopped mid-sentence. The silence was suffocating, hanging for a heartbeat too long. Then her voice returned colder, sharper, deliberate. "Something funny about constitutional rights? Justice Kavanaugh?" The air collapsed inward. It was audacity no one had expected to see in this room. A freshman congresswoman daring to challenge a Supreme Court justice to his face, naming the disrespect out loud. Kavanaugh, momentarily startled, shifted in his seat. "I'm simply noting that the precedent you cited has been substantially narrowed by subsequent rulings," he managed, his tone forced into gravity. But Crockett was ready. Her lips tightened into the faintest of smiles, not amusement, but the satisfaction of a trap sprung. "Then perhaps you could explain your reasoning, rather than laughing at mine," she said, "because the millions of Americans whose rights are at stake deserve more than a chuckle." Chief Justice Roberts adjusted in his chair, uneasy, as if he might intervene. But Crockett pressed forward before he could. "In fact, Justice Kavanaugh," she said, turning slightly toward the screen, "since you find my citation so amusing, allow me to remind you of your own words." The monitors flickered, and there it was. Text projected in bold from Kavanaugh's own opinion in Crawford versus Marion County. Crockett's team had cued it like a card up the sleeve. Voting regulations that place disproportionate burdens on identifiable segments of the voting population require heightened scrutiny to ensure the fundamental right to vote is not impaired. The quote hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. Kavanaugh's smirk evaporated. His pen twitched in his hand, then stilled. Several justices turned their eyes toward him. Reporters typed furiously. "That was your standard, Justice Kavanaugh," Crockett continued, her tone precise, controlled. And today I've shown evidence, overwhelming evidence, that this law does exactly that. Disproportionate burdens, identifiable communities, the very conditions you warned against. She let the silence absorb it. Then came the second strike. In your 2021 address at Notre Dame, she added, her cadence slow and deliberate. You insisted that consistency in applying legal principles is the bedrock of judicial integrity. Consistency, Justice Kavanaugh. I couldn't agree more. The words landed like hammer blows. She wasn't just countering his laugh, she was using his own record, his own voice, as the rope to bind him. Journalists had stopped typing. They were staring now, eyes wide, as if unwilling to miss even the way Kavanaugh shifted in his chair. Justice Jackson, careful to remain neutral, allowed the faintest upward twitch at the corner of her mouth. Crockett swept the room with her eyes, drawing every justice into her line of fire. I'm not asking for sympathy, she declared. I'm asking for consistency. Apply the standard Justice Kavanaugh himself articulated. Apply heightened scrutiny. Follow the evidence. And if you do, there can be only one conclusion. This law cannot stand. The chamber seemed to shrink around her words. Every marble column, every robed figure, every whispering observer was pulled into the gravity of her declaration. The smirk was gone. The laughter silenced. What remained was a question no one on that bench could evade. Would they honor their own standards or reveal themselves by breaking them? The impact was immediate, like a bell struck too hard to be ignored. Several justices bent low to scribble hurried notes, though their faces betrayed little. Elena Kagan leaned sideways toward Sonia Sotomayor, lips moving in a whisper that never reached the microphones. Brett Kavanaugh, who had opened the exchange with a chuckle, now sat rigidly upright, jaw tight, cheeks flushed in a way the camera lights could not disguise. Chief Justice Roberts cleared his throat, the familiar sound of a referee stepping in. Thank you, Congresswoman Crockett. Justice Kavanaugh, did you have a question for the representative? All eyes shifted. The man who just moments earlier had wielded authority with smirks and interruptions now seemed caught in his own stillness. He hesitated, blinked, shuffled his notes. Seconds passed, seconds that, on the outside, would mean little, but here stretched like an eternity. Finally, Kavanaugh leaned toward the mic. His voice was softer, more deliberate, stripped of its earlier superiority. I want to clarify that I was not dismissing the importance of voting rights. My concern, he said, is with the court overstepping its proper role in state election administration. It was a retreat disguised as clarification. But Crockett wasn't about to hand him an exit. She pivoted back to the bench, posture unbroken. With respect, Justice Kavanaugh, your chuckle spoke volumes, she answered, her voice sharpened to a scalpel. And the proper role of this court, as you yourself have written, is to apply heightened scrutiny when fundamental rights are at stake. That is all I am asking, that you stand by your own philosophy. The gallery went still again. There were no gasps this time, no whispers. The silence was heavier, denser, as if every person in the chamber recognized the shift. The freshman congresswoman had locked the justice in his own cage of words. Crockett returned to her table, shoulders square, expression unbroken. The justices moved to other questions, but the room did not feel the same. The moment had taken root. Kavanaugh's smirk would not return that morning. At 11:45 a.m., the hearing concluded. By noon, the world outside was already crackling. Clips of the exchange, Kavanaugh's chuckle, Crockett's precise retort, were spreading across social media like sparks leaping from dry brush. Courtroom cameras had caught it clean. The audio sharp, the timing perfect. On Twitter, hashtags bloomed. Crockett shut down. No laughing matter. Voting rights. By 1 o'clock, Crockett was trending above the NFL scores. By 2, late-night producers were drafting monologues. Cable networks cut into programming with replays. One chyron read, "Freshman rep challenges justice. Something funny about rights." Another asked bluntly, "Did Kavanaugh just lose the room?" Even conservative analysts grudgingly admitted the effectiveness. Whether you agree with her politics or not, one right-leaning commentator said on air, Congresswoman Crockett came extraordinarily well prepared. She knew how to seize the moment and flip the dynamic in her favor. That takes skill. But the echo wasn't confined to screens. By evening, 3 moderate senators previously undecided on a voting rights bill pending in Congress announced they would support it. Each cited the clarity of the constitutional arguments they had heard in the chamber. The odds of the bill clearing a deadlock had shifted in real time, powered by one confrontation, one laugh, one refusal to be dismissed. Legal scholars rushed to publish their takes. One constitutional law professor wrote, "What Crockett achieved today was a reframing of the entire debate." This case was pitched as states' rights versus federal oversight. She repositioned it as a test of consistency, integrity, and the fundamental nature of voting rights. That is a harder frame for the court to sidestep. For Jasmine Crockett herself, the transformation was already underway. That morning, she had been a freshman congresswoman barely known outside her state. By nightfall, her name was synonymous with a viral moment of defiance. Interview requests flooded her office. Party leaders whispered about her as a rising star. Strategists saw in her a future voice of leadership. What made it powerful wasn't just the legal trap she had set. It was the way she carried herself. The way she refused to be diminished by a chuckle from the heights of power. It resonated with anyone who had ever been laughed at, waved off, or made to feel small. Crockett hadn't simply argued. She had stood her ground. And the message was spreading fast. By sunrise, the clip wasn't just news. It felt like a story people needed to tell each other. 25 million views in under a day. It ran on breakfast table phones, lecture hall projectors, and every cable show's breaking banner. The sound that started it, the chuckle, was now a loop the country couldn't stop replaying. Community organizers moved fast. They pulled Crockett's line, "Something funny about constitutional rights," and stamped it on flyers for weekend registration drives. In her district, a line formed outside her office that wrapped around the block. People carried thank you notes, church bulletins, even homemade cookies. Elenina Washington, 67, retired teacher, waited 2 hours just to sign a giant card. "I voted for 40 years, she told the local camera, voice trembling a little. "But I never felt someone truly fought for my right to do it until yesterday." On campuses, classrooms turned into watch parties. Law students paused the video, frame by frame, like sports tape. "The way she used his own words, Crawford, right back at him was surgical," said Tomas Rodriguez, head of a constitutional law society. Professors rewrote syllabi overnight. Several added a new class module: consistency, advocacy, and power dynamics. Back in D.C., Crockett's office went loud. Over 15,000 emails and calls in 48 hours, coming from all 50 states. A grandmother in Ohio wrote about 2 bus transfers to a DMV, now open only on weekdays. A warehouse worker in Arizona left a voicemail about losing pay to chase paperwork. A disabled veteran in Florida listed the steps he'd taken just to vote: 3 trips, 2 forms, 1 more letter. Staffers began cataloging these messages into a digital archive. "This is not just case law anymore," said Crockett's communications director to a knot of reporters. "It's dignity. People are saying, 'Finally, we feel seen.'" 3 days later, Kavanaugh took the stage at a long-scheduled law school event. The moderator avoided the topic, but the justice didn't entirely. "The bench and the bar share a responsibility to maintain mutual respect," he said. "Even in disagreement, decorum must prevail." Some heard apology between the lines. Others heard a finger wag. Either way, the room felt the bruise. Behind the scenes, whispers moved faster than memos. One clerk confided off the record, "There's soul-searching going on." Viral moments don't just dent reputations, they dent the institution if we look dismissive. Another source put it more dryly: "Optics matter, especially now." Officially, Kavanaugh's chambers stayed silent, no statements, no clarifications. Unofficially, friends said he was frustrated with the narrative. "He thinks the laugh was taken out of context," said a former clerk, "but he also knows perception is reality in a room with cameras." Supporters tried a defense. The chuckle was misread, a reaction to precedent, not a person. The clip, merciless as ever, didn't help them. A smirk is a smirk on replay. Professional groups tried to thread the needle. The president of a National Bar Association released a carefully balanced note. Respect for the court is foundational. So, too, is a vigorous defense of constitutional rights. Both must be held at once, especially when fundamental freedoms are at stake. It sounded like diplomacy, but the subtext was plain. The public saw what they saw. Law schools turned the moment into curriculum. Beyond doctrine, they taught restraint and courage. One trial advocacy professor froze the video at the exact second before Crockett said, "Obstruction." "Watch her hands," he told the class. No flinch, no rush. She lets the silence work for her. That's control. Pens scratched. Laptops clicked. A new case study was born. Then came the letters. A group of 157 law professors signed an open letter praising Crockett's careful, consistent constitutional advocacy, scrupulously avoiding direct censure of the justice. The message: you can respect the court and still applaud the challenge. Conservative legal coalitions fired back the same afternoon, calling her approach theatrical tactics that undermine dignity. But even they seemed to understand they were pushing uphill. The picture green suit, raised chin, a laugh turned on its owner had already set. The debate widened beyond one exchange. Former Supreme Court clerks argued on podcasts about unwritten rules. "You don't call out a justice's demeanor," one said. "But respect runs both ways," countered another. Bar panels filled with phrases that hadn't been fashionable a year ago. Power imbalance, viral accountability, modern advocacy. Old norms and new realities were now in the same room, staring each other down. In Crockett's world, the surge didn't feel abstract. Volunteers kept showing up. Churches asked for voter education nights. A union hall in Milwaukee requested a Zoom Q&A. A high school senior from Atlanta wrote, "I'm not old enough to vote yet, but when I am, I'm bringing people with me." Reporters kept pressing Crockett for a victory lap. She didn't take it. When a microphone blocked her path in a Capitol hallway, "Did you mean to embarrass the justice?" She shook her head. "This isn't about embarrassing anyone," she said, voice even. "It's about putting voting rights where they belong, at the center of our democracy." That line traveled. It landed well because it was simple, and because, after all the noise, it returned the story to the only question that mattered. Who gets to vote, and how hard do we make it for them to try? The aftershock didn't scream. It throbbed steady everywhere at once. In classrooms and church basements, in podcasts and practice guides. In a silent clip of a smirk that backfired and a single word obstruction that hit like a gavel. By the end of the week, what had started as a single chuckle had swollen into a storm too loud to ignore. Polling data landed on every strategist's desk like a dropped glass, shattering the storylines both parties had rehearsed. 68% of Americans said they had seen or heard about the exchange, an astronomical figure for a Supreme Court hearing. More striking, 72% of those viewers said their opinion of Jasmine Crockett had improved. More than half admitted their opinion of Justice Kavanaugh had worsened. For political operatives, these were not just numbers. They were tremors signaling a realignment. On cable news, a grizzled campaign consultant shook his head. This is the kind of moment that cuts through partisanship. You don't need a law degree to get it. Everyone knows what it feels like to be dismissed, and everyone admires when somebody fires back. At the White House, antennae twitched. The press secretary stood at the podium, flipping through prepared notes she suddenly didn't need. "The American people have made it clear where they stand," she said, voice sharp, eyes steady on the camera. "They want their rights protected." With that, she announced a renewed push for voting rights legislation, once left for dead, now suddenly breathing again. Capitol Hill scrambled. Phone lines lit up, aides rushed between offices, and senators who had been dodging reporters days earlier now planted their flags. 3 moderates, long undecided, declared support for the bill. One told a knot of journalists in the hallway, "The hearing underscored what's at stake. His phrasing was careful, but the echo was unmistakable. He was borrowing Crockett's words. Legal analysts, meanwhile, dissected the corner Kavanaugh now occupied. A court watcher on primetime spelled it out. She boxed him in. If he rules against protections, he contradicts his own precedent. If he rules for them, he looks like he bowed to public pressure. Either way, his credibility takes a hit. The clip went viral under the caption, "Checkmate." But the earthquake wasn't just legal or political, it was cultural. Searches for voting rights surged by 3,000%. Community groups reported their phones ringing off the hook. Volunteers signed up, donations rolled in, organizers extended office hours just to handle the wave. Civil rights organizations put Crockett's phrasing on pamphlets, turning reasonable verification versus deliberate obstruction into a rallying slogan that showed up on posters, church bulletins, even memes. "Young voters are paying attention," said Marcus Johnson, who ran a nonpartisan education nonprofit. He sounded both astonished and hopeful. "They've seen hearings before, sure, but this, they felt it. They saw power mock and then get reversed. That lands differently." Across the country, lawyers rewrote their scripts. A civil rights legal defense director told a reporter, "She didn't just toss around statistics, she made them human. An old woman taking 2 buses, a single mom losing a day's pay. We're following that model." Conservatives scrambled too. Some dismissed it as theater. Others sneered about YouTube politics. But even in dismissal, their unease leaked through. Because they knew the image, one chuckle, one green suit, one scalpel-sharp comeback, wasn't fading. Even former clerks, usually silent, began whispering. "There's an unwritten rule," one explained quietly. "You don't confront a justice's demeanor. But there's another rule too. Respect flows both ways." That's what this moment cracked open. And cracked open it was. What might have been a fleeting flicker of disrespect had metastasized into a national inflection point. A line was drawn between old norms of hierarchy and new demands for accountability. The conversation was no longer just about voter ID. It was about power, who has it, how it's wielded, and who dares to laugh when rights are on the table. And for the first time in a long while, millions of Americans felt the answer belonged to them. 6 weeks later, the nation felt like it was holding its breath. Every news ticker flashed the same headline: Decision Day. Outside the Supreme Court, the plaza overflowed. Supporters of voting rights carried hand-painted posters quoting Crockett's words, reasonable verification versus deliberate obstruction. Opponents gathered with their own banners, insisting on election integrity. Reporters lined the steps shoulder to shoulder, their microphones catching the rising buzz of the crowd. Inside, the courtroom air was tight, electric. Journalists sat hunched over laptops, fingers poised above keys, eyes darting toward the bench. Law clerks whispered to one another, quickly silenced by the bailiff's warning glance. In that solemn chamber, even the scratch of a pen felt loud. Then Chief Justice Roberts cleared his throat and began to read. His voice was steady, almost too calm for what was about to land. The words came carefully, measured, but they struck with force. 6, 3. The court was upholding most of the contested voting rights protections. But the true jolt was not the numbers, it was the reasoning. Roberts read aloud from the majority opinion. When regulations place disproportionate burdens on identifiable segments of the voting population, they must be subject to heightened scrutiny to ensure the fundamental right to vote remains accessible to all eligible citizens. The sentence rippled through the room like thunder. Reporters froze, then typed furiously. The language wasn't new, it was Kavanaugh's own, lifted almost word for word from his prior rulings, the very precedent Crockett had thrust before him in the chamber weeks earlier. Brett Kavanaugh's name appeared among the justices concurring with the majority. Cameras panned toward him, catching a face held carefully still, lips pressed thin, eyes fixed on the desk before him. There was no smirk this time, no chuckle. Just the weight of words, he could not escape his own words, returned to him like a mirror. Gasps rose softly from the gallery. A law student in the audience whispered, "She did it," before being hushed by the marshal. Outside, phones lit up as the first tweets hit the feed. 6-3. Court upholds protections. Crockett's strategy worked. Within minutes, hashtags surged back onto the trending lists. Crockett effect and heightened scrutiny climbed alongside them. On the courthouse steps, cheers broke out. "Democracy wins," someone shouted, and the chant spread. A woman in a green blazer, her own tribute to Crockett, lifted a sign that read, "Our voices matter." Cameras zoomed in, broadcasting her tears across the country. Legal analysts raced to interpret. One constitutional scholar, cornered by reporters in the hallway, shook his head in awe. "This is extraordinary," he said. She forced the court to hold itself accountable. By tying their hands to their own precedent, she changed the trajectory of this ruling. Cable news cut to split screens. On one side, Crockett walking calmly through a crush of microphones. On the other, anchors exclaiming over the court's surprising alignment. "Congresswoman, how do you respond?" a journalist shouted. Crockett stopped briefly, her emerald jacket bright under the sunlight. "This isn't about me," she said firmly. "It's about the millions of Americans who deserve equal access to the ballot. Today, the court affirmed that principle. That's the victory." The ripple reached far beyond Washington. In state houses across the country, lawmakers hit pause. Bills proposing new restrictions were quietly shelved. Attorneys general called emergency meetings, reviewing whether their laws could survive the court's newly clarified scrutiny. Advocacy groups filed fresh lawsuits, armed with the ruling's exact words. But maybe the most remarkable ripple was cultural. A national poll released days later showed that 64% of Americans could accurately explain what heightened scrutiny meant in the context of voting rights. Ordinary people, not just lawyers, now spoke fluently about a constitutional standard. A talk radio caller in Ohio summed it up. "I'm no lawyer, but I get it now. If the rules hit one group harder than another, they'd better have a damn good reason. Otherwise, it's wrong." For Crockett, the shift was personal too. Invitations poured in from universities, civic organizations, and legal conferences. Students packed auditoriums just to hear her recount how she had stood her ground in that marble chamber. Party leaders took notice, moving her onto committees where her clarity would matter most. Her re-election campaign, once modest, ballooned overnight. Small dollar donations arrived from every state, many with short notes attached. "You reminded me, my vote counts. You gave me courage to stand up at work. Thank you for not backing down." At one campus event, a student asked her the question everyone wanted to know. How did she find the nerve to call out a Supreme Court justice in front of the world? Crockett paused, smiled, and answered simply, "When you know you're right on the law, you don't have to accept disrespect no matter who it comes from." The room erupted in applause, a standing ovation that lasted long after she left the stage. And so, the verdict was more than a ruling, it was a turning point. The law had shifted, yes, but so had the country's understanding of its own democracy. The laugh meant to dismiss had become the lever of change. The smirk meant to belittle had become the face of defeat. And the words of one congresswoman, steady and unflinching, had become the words of the court itself. For the green suit, it became legend. Overnight, reporters called it power green. Fashion blogs dissected the shade as if it were constitutional text, and department stores scrambled to stock blazers in the same color. Store managers posted quick videos, racks empty by noon, customers laughing as they tried on emerald jackets in mirror light. For young lawyers, it was more than a trend. It was a uniform, a way of carrying a piece of Crockett's defiance into their own courtrooms. "I wore mine for my moot court final," one law student posted on TikTok, twirling in front of a mirror. Not just because it looks good, but because it feels like armor. A comment beneath it read, "Not fashion-proof." But the real legacy wasn't fabric, it was people. Across the country, applications for civil rights law fellowships surged 43%. Admissions officers said they had never seen so many essays citing one name. Again and again, young women and students of color wrote about the same moment, a freshman congresswoman standing in emerald green, facing down a justice's small dismissive reaction. Law school forums filled with threads titled "How to Argue Like Crockett," full of students swapping clips, outlines, and the one-liners that steadied their nerves. At a judicial clerkship ceremony, one graduate stepped up to the microphone, visibly nervous, and then smiled. She showed us. "You don't have to pick between being respected and being effective," she said, voice growing stronger as applause spread across the hall. "You can demand both." The crowd rose to its feet. A judge in the front row nodded once, then twice, as if agreeing out loud without a word. Later, in the lobby, two new clerks wrapped emerald scarves around their shoulders and posed under the courthouse seal. In classrooms, professors projected the clip alongside Brown versus Board arguments, teaching advocacy not just as doctrine but as courage. Trial advocacy instructors paused the video mid-frame, freezing Crockett's unwavering gaze. "Look at this," one professor told his students. "She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't lose control. She doesn't get flustered. She just holds the line. That's how you answer power with power." Students scribbled furiously, knowing they were watching a new kind of case study. Another professor added a quick exercise. Write the sentence that lands like her word obstruction, 10 words or fewer. The room went silent, pens flying. Outside academia, the phrase "the Kavanaugh chuckle" escaped into the bloodstream of popular culture. Late-night comedians pounced on it. "You know you've lost an argument," one joked, "when your laugh ends up in a law school syllabus." The audience roared. Morning radio shows ran call-ins. People told stories of meetings where a tiny laugh shut them down and the comeback they wished they'd had. Workplace consultants picked it up too, using the clip in corporate seminars. "We've all been laughed at in a meeting," one trainer explained to a room full of executives. "Now, thanks to Crockett, we know what a comeback looks like." In a downtown office, a mid-level manager taped a green sticky note to her laptop. "Hold the line." But the resonance was deeper than jokes or seminars. In church basements and union halls, the story was retold not as a viral clip but as a parable. That power can be answered, that laughter, meant to diminish, can be turned into a weapon. "It wasn't just her words," said one organizer in Detroit. "It was her calm. She made everyone watching believe we don't have to take disrespect even from the highest seat in the land." In Houston, a deacon held up a flyer for a Sunday voter clinic, stamped with 3 words in bold: respect, proof, vote. Crockett herself, weeks later in her first major network interview, was asked the inevitable, did she mean to embarrass Justice Kavanaugh? She smiled faintly, shook her head. "It was never about putting anyone in their place," she said softly. "It was about putting voting rights in their proper place at the center of our democracy." Viewers across the country clipped that line, reposting it with captions like, "Say it louder for the people in the back and center the right, not the ego." A mother in Phoenix filmed a 30-second video in her kitchen. "I showed my daughter this clip. I told her, this is how you ask for respect and keep it." The principle carried far. Months after the ruling, Crockett walked through a newly opened voter assistance center in her district. The hallway smelled faintly of fresh paint and coffee. The crowd pressed in, clapping, cheering, some holding homemade signs with her words in block letters. Consistency matters. Obstruction is a choice. An 7-year-old man shuffled forward, his hands trembling as he reached for hers, tears pooled in his eyes. "I never thought I'd live to see someone stand up for my right to vote the way you did," he said. His voice broke, but he finished the thought, "You made me believe the system can still work for people like me." Around them, the room fell quiet. A young volunteer whispered, "That's why we're here." A camera operator lowered his rig and wiped his eye with the back of his hand. Another volunteer brought the man a chair. He refused gently. "I'm standing for this," he said, and the room applauded. Reporters clustered near the exit, calling out questions. "Congresswoman, what's next?" one asked. Crockett glanced at the packed waiting area, teenagers filling out forms, retirees comparing documents, a nurse still in scrubs checking a checklist twice. "This," she said, "making it simple to participate. Making sure a day's pay or a bus schedule doesn't decide who gets heard." A teenager at the table looked up and flashed a thumbs up. I brought 2 friends, she said, shy and proud. For Crockett, that encounter crystallized everything. The hashtags, the headlines, even the political momentum, they all mattered. But nothing matched the weight of one citizen in one neighborhood finally believing his voice still counted. Later that night, she texted her staff a single sentence: "Let's keep opening doors." The marble chamber had given her a platform, but the echo traveled further than she or anyone expected. It spread into classrooms, comedy shows, social feeds, living rooms, and voter centers. A bookshop stacked a display called Voices and Votes, sliding a green-covered paperback to the front. Community calendars added Power Green Day to encourage people to wear the color when they registered new voters. What began as a smirk and a chuckle ended as a movement people could feel in their hands: clipboards, forms, fresh voter cards tucked into wallets. And so the story circled back to its origin. A laugh meant to belittle instead ignited a wave. A small gesture meant to dismiss instead created a symbol. One congresswoman's steady reply had cracked open the illusion of untouchable authority and, in doing so, reminded a nation that democracy does not belong to those who mock it. It belongs to those who defend it. Or as a sign taped to a church door put it, "We don't laugh people out of their rights here." And if that resonates, if you believe facts should outweigh bluster and accountability should outlast arrogance, don't let it stop here. Keep the story alive. Share it in your group chat, in your community, at your table, because democracy is never on autopilot. It breathes only when we guard it. Subscribe, stay engaged, and add your voice to the chorus that refuses to be laughed off the stage.